Hi, everyone. So today I thought I'd take the opportunity to explain what socionics is to someone who's never heard about it before, which is probably the large majority of the population on this planet. So a lot of people. I'm also going to try and keep this short, try and keep it concise because I know I tend to go a bit overboard in some of my explanations. So, what is socionics? What on earth is it? Well, it is a hypothesis about personality being divisible into 16 different types. And the idea being that there are essentially almost anyone on this planet can fit into one of those 16 types in some sort of meaningful way, which can help to describe their relationships with others, what motivates them, what drives them, why they do the things that they do. Um, Now, when it comes to understanding personality, when you think of personality, it's quite a complex thing. Lots of stuff involved. There's motivations. There are values. There are likes, dislikes. What someone tends to do, their habits, often their behaviors, how they come across, and debatably, some can even say that it's to do with certain natural strengths and capabilities. Other people make that as being distinct from personality. Well, either way, the two main ways of approaching personality in the modern day are trait approaches and type approaches. So, what are these two things? Trait approaches, a very common one is the big five. It's very well backed up by science in terms of utilizing this complicated statistical technique called a factor analysis to look at all words in the English language. And they found that they naturally fall into five natural clusters, and they use that to build this theory of essentially personality being made up of five different factors. Well, that's very good for testing the mass population when it comes to finding certain trends, certain differences in scores, explaining differences in behavior, that sort of thing. The problem with a trait approach is that it doesn't give you a sense of the why behind people. It only gives you a sense of a what. Oh, they are 98% conscientious. So they're very hardworking. But why are they hardworking? What is motivating them to be hardworking, to be achievement striving, to need things to be neat and orderly and tidy and all those other things? And also, if someone gets high in conscientiousness, you'd have to sort of to differentiate between someone who's very orderly and someone who's simply hardworking, but not orderly. You have to sort of split it up into underlying facets and test them in each of those things. But again, it's not giving you a sense of why are they motivated to be orderly but not hardworking, and why might someone else be motivated towards being both? And another thing it doesn't explain is how and why someone who is very highly conscientious might actually, depending on the kind of conscientiousness, get on well with someone who's actually not as conscientious. And what are the rules upon which that can happen when it can't happen? You can only draw generalizations based on what the statistics in that are because you don't understand the why behind it. So it can't really tell you someone's values so much as what they test themselves as often doing. So type is the approach which is better equipped to deal with stuff such as motivations and the why behind the what. So the sacrifice is it's a lot harder to empirically test type because you have to try to find these categories and find a real basis for them in nature. There's often been a struggle for a very common kind of type approach called the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which essentially divides up people into whether they're extroverts, introverts, intuitors, sensors, thinkers versus feelers, and judges versus perceivers. And it doesn't really get at why these dichotomies should really exist. Why aren't people just somewhere in the middle on average? And they've often struggled with that criticism. Now, Myers-Briggs type indicator is what we call a Jungian typology theory, and Jungian is perhaps the most common or popular approach to type theory is the Jungian approach, which looks at the underlying motivators as a sort of cognitive function, something which is sort of a dominant lens through which we see the world, and people vary in what dominant lenses they use. And Carl Jung, who in the 1920s, in his book Psychological Types, set out what these different lenses were, these different cognitive functions. Now, the Myers-Briggs type indicator simplified quite a bit of that, in my opinion, overly simplified, and kind of sort of threw out the baby with the bathwater on occasion. Now, the Myers-Briggs is a Western development of this. This was developed predominantly in America by Isabel Briggs Myers and Catherine Cook Briggs, her mother. The other theory, which is socionics, that was developed in the East. That was developed in Lithuania by a Lithuanian academic, Ausra Augustina Vičiūtė, very long, hard to pronounce name. Now, what socionics brings to this is it retains, I'd say, more of that sort of Jungian approach of focusing in on what he called cognitive functions. In socionics, we call information metabolism elements. And it combines Jung's ideas with the work of another guy called Antoni Kempinski, which talks about this idea called information metabolism. This is the idea that, in the same way that an organism digests food and converts it into energy, that's energy metabolism. Information metabolism is the idea that we are oriented towards digesting mentally different kinds of information. And we may vary in what kinds of information we are best at digesting and metabolizing and converting into our decisions, into our actions. This idea that you look at the world, you understand it, you piece it together, and then you act upon it. So you have this idea in sociology of the breaking down of information, first of all, into discrete kinds. So, for instance, you can have physical, real information, which is sensation, or there's abstract, imagined information, which is going to be intuition. You've got ethics, which is about the judgments you make, which are personal and subjective, sort of emotional in nature, and logic, the more sort of impersonal, sort of sciencey or factual or rules-based judgment making. These sorts of domains of information. And different people, different types, I should say, are meant to differentiate from each other in terms of how well they process these different kinds of information. There's also this idea that you can value certain kinds of information over others. So what I mean by valuing, let's say you are someone who is very emotionally expressive. Well, you might not necessarily be emotionally expressive. You may appreciate and value emotional expression. What are people caring about? What is the group buzz? What's that group feeling? And it's going to be very different from someone who instead cares about or values the sort of more personal one-to-one relationship, saying things in a more matter-of-fact, very sort of sincere way, no drama, just being sort of quite matter-of-fact about it and holding to individual one-to-one relationships over a group public pleasing approach. These are differences in values. So one thing which socionics brings, which is very different to, say, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, is a difference between being good at something, being natural at working with people, for instance, versus having a value towards being more public, group oriented in working with people versus being sort of more one-to-one relationship oriented in how you handle people. So there's a difference between valuing something and being good at it. And so when you look at a socionics type, you're looking at a map, what we call a model A. It's almost like a filing cabinet of the different kinds of information you can be oriented towards, and there are 8 of them, put into 8 certain slots, which are called functions. And these slots basically describe how you approach each kind of information in the world. That's all information in existence can be, based on some quite clear dichotomies, broken down into these 8 different categories, which are then put into the slot for each individual type. So essentially, people differ in what they like versus what they're good at. So you could like something and be good at it. That's a key part of your personality. That's what's called the ego block, taken from Freud's idea of the ego. You've also got the superego, which is not valuing something and not being good at it. So that's kind of people's expectations of you. Are you likely to fail? There's the super id. This is where you value something, but you're not good at it. So this is the area of growth and development, how you get better as a person by learning and growing and also being helped by others. And finally, there's that id block, which is the part which you don't value, but you are good at. So this is where you sort of take things for granted. You can kick back and relax here, or just not so interesting to you, but you're just good at it. So that's quite a complex structure for understanding personality. It has a far greater explanatory power than, say, the Myers-Briggs type indicator. It has a clear hierarchy of motivations for explaining why someone is doing what they're doing based around how they process or metabolize the different kinds of information around us, whether that's real concrete information, abstract information, emotional feelings, you could say, or more logical thinking. And from this, Socionics is able to build a picture of intertype relationships, how different types are likely to interact with others. So, are you more likely to be someone who is more matter of fact in communication? That means you're likely to clash with someone who's more exaggerated in their communication, something a bit more dramatic, a bit more about conveying how they passionately feel, and you're more matter of fact. You might not take each other very seriously. The more passionate person may think you don't really care about anything because you're not expressing it in a very emotional, feeling sort of way. Whereas a more matter of fact person may find the other person to be overly exaggerating what the facts are and thereby cannot be trusted. Some people are just very intense and need to be very active and ambitious, need to be acting all the time. Other people need their environment to be very calm and not intense. These are sorts of clashes you're going to be seeing in socionics between different types. And this gives you the means of understanding how these differ, how these vary. So it's a very meaningful and very useful hypothesis. Now, the challenge is finding the scientific evidence to support it. Now, I think you can derive a proof from the sort of more philosophical, logical understanding of the breakdown of reality. The idea of something being external to you and real and objective versus subjective and internal to you. That's a category we use in our regular understanding of the world. It's very well grounded. So I think there is an approach to building up an understanding of type through logical proofs, first of all philosophically, and then devising experiments which can prove it to actually work in real life. Anecdotally, it's been shown to work in real life. It's just a question of actually finding an experiment to show that more commonly across. There is evidence which does support some of the hypotheses of socionics. For instance, the idea of duality. What is duality? The idea that the ideal relationship is one where two people are very different in what they're good at, but they are very much aligned in their values. These are duals. These are very different personalities who complement one another. Now, that's supported in the research. Research into team diversity shows that people who are very high in strengths diversity, so everyone in the team is very good at different things, right? That makes a very strong team. But also, you want low values diversity, because if you aren't aligned to the same goal, if you don't want the same things ultimately, you're not really going to want to work together. And that bears out in the research. So there is a challenge to find the empirical evidence, but the evidence of the main assertions of socionics to how we'd actually use it are actually already supported. There's sort of a middle bit to connect up. But this is what makes me so passionate. It makes me so excited about this potentially very helpful, very meaningful theory for common use once people get to know it. It's very complicated. You kind of have to take the equivalent almost a degree to really know it. It takes a long time. I've got a very long course you could take if you want to learn all about it. But yes, in terms of applications of socionics, you can use this to better understand yourself, to better grow as an individual, understand what is a path of growth for you, which is actually good for you and will actually make you feel fulfilled rather than what's just pushed upon you and expected of you by others. And being able to differentiate that, socionics gives you the tools to do so. So very good for coaching and understanding yourself. It's very good for also understanding others. Where are other people coming from and their difference, their diverse approach to the world? And that's helpful for bridging gaps between people, understanding people better, team building, relationship counseling. But it's also good for knowing what kinds of people are perhaps most naturally suited to support you and complement you, and vice versa in the world. So it's also very useful for dating. Um, Also, I think it can be used well to help tailor environments to each individual. Let's say in education, for kids going to school, is the style of learning one which is going to be well organized for how they naturally like to absorb information, where it's more piecemeal, factual, or more structural, that kind of thing. There's lots of different applications for socionics. So I hope that was clear to people, and I managed to do it in under 15 minutes. Good. Right. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in.